Thank you very much, Richard, for those kind words. So the format of this afternoon is we have 3 separate panels. In each instance, the chair of the panel will be introduced by one of the co-directors, and then the chair of the panel will introduce the panelists. Now, two people participating in the first panel, Katrina and Hélène, are not able to join us for weather-related reasons, but I believe that Katrina, yes, is here, and Hélène is here also. You can see them on this screen here, and if for the first panel, the weight of the room would like to shift in that direction because that's the one place you can see them. So I will just introduce Katrina, and then Katrina will introduce the panelists. Katrina Forrester is a political theorist and historian of 20th century political thought. She is the John Loeb Associate Professor of the Social Sciences in the Department of Government and Committee on Social Studies at Harvard University. She's the author of a number of books that are highly relevant to our topic today, including In the Shadow of Justice, Post-War Liberalism and the Remaking of Political Philosophy. And she's currently at work on a book provisionally titled In and Against, Struggles Over the State in the Late 20th Century. Her research has been widely published, and she's also, if you don't want to read about political science, she's also written about Bob Dylan. So, Katrina, let me turn it over to you to introduce the panelists, please.
Right, thank you so much, Professor Johnson, for that very kind introduction. I hope you can all hear me okay. Some nods, fantastic. I'm extremely sorry I can't be with you in person, but it's exciting to be here, at least virtually, in this difficult political climate to discuss what continues to be one of the biggest challenges of our time. Wealth inequality has long been a concern for political philosophers, but today it takes new and extreme forms. So given this, how should we think about wealth inequality? What does it entail for politics? How does it affect democracy? How does it shape markets? How does it harm those who do not own wealth and have few prospects of doing so? And how might those who possess extreme wealth be held accountable? And do they need to be? These are some of the most pressing philosophical questions of our time. So here today to help us think through them, to think about wealth inequality, what it is, what it entails, and how it affects economic, social, and political life in this country and the world, please join me in welcoming our 3 speakers. I'll introduce them now, and then each speaker will speak for 10 minutes before we begin discussion. So this is the order that they will speak. First, let's welcome Hélène Landemore, the Damon Wells 58 Professor of Political Science at Yale University, a faculty fellow at the Institute for Social and Policy Studies, and a distinguished researcher at the Institute for the Ethics of AI at Oxford University. Professor Landemore is the author of several books, including Democratic Reason, Open Democracy, and I think forthcoming Politics Without Politicians. Her work explores how political systems can better harness collective intelligence, inclusion, and deliberation. She has done work with governments, NGOs, and democratic reformers centrally in France, has written for publications including the Boston Review, the Washington Post, and Foreign Policy, and her work has been featured in many publications, among other outlets, a New Yorker profile. Now, next up will be Oren. Cass is the founder and chief economist of American Compass, which he founded in 2020, and editor of The New Conservatives, Restoring America's Commitment to Family, Community, and Industry. He's a contributing opinion writer for both the Financial Times and the New York Times, and was previously senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, where he authored many publications. His 2018 book, The Once and Future Worker, A Vision for the Renewal of Work in America, was widely reviewed and has been called absolutely brilliant by New York Times columnist David Brooks, and also praised by Vice President J.D. Vance. Now, last will be Elizabeth Anderson, the John Dewey Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy and Women's and Gender Studies and Law at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She is the author of several important and influential books, including The Imperative of Integration, Private Government, and most recently, Hijacked, How Neoliberalism Turned the Work Ethic Against Workers and How Workers Can Take It Back. She has written extensively on topics that include egalitarianism, democratic theory and social epistemology, and the philosophy of work. And she has won fellowships from the ACLS and Guggenheim Foundations, has been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the British Academy. She has served as president of the Central Division of the American Philosophical Association, and she is also a 2019 MacArthur Genius Fellow. So please welcome our distinguished speakers for what I'm sure will be a wide-ranging discussion. And Hélène, over to you.
Thank you, Katrina. Hi, everyone. Like Katrina, I'm very sorry I can't be here. I'm actually stuck in Paris, which is not that bad, but I would actually have preferred to be in person to participate in this exciting conference. So I am going to try to answer the question, do wealth inequalities matter? In short, I think that within limits, they need not matter politically in an authentic, robust democracy, but that given our political system plutocratic bias, they inevitably do, with all the problems that ensue. So let me take a step back. I have long thought that Michael Walzer's approach is the right one for thinking about equality and inequality. In his 1983 book, Spheres of Justice, Walzer, a political theorist, argues that justice is not governed by a single universal principle. Instead, it's pluralistic. Societies are made up of different spheres of social goods: money, political power, education, healthcare, honor, love, and each sphere has its own appropriate principles of distribution. So political power should be distributed democratically, according to voters' choice, jobs maybe by merit, welfare by need, money by market exchange, etc., etc. So the key ideal is what Walzer calls complex equality. A person's advantage in one sphere should not automatically give them advantage in others. People can be unequal in many ways, but not unequal in the same way across everything. And in particular, in a well-functioning democracy, wealth should not translate into greater political influence or greater access. It's true, the principle should still be one person, one vote. So for Walzer, wealth inequality is not a problem per se. I think I agree with him. It becomes a problem when wealth leaks into other spheres and distorts the distribution of other goods. Most importantly, political power. And this happens when being rich effectively buys political office or influence, so that some people have many votes in practice while others have only one. Or when political power in turn buys legal immunity or privileged access to healthcare or other kinds of benefits. And that turns into the definition of tyranny for Walzer, the dominance of one good, money, across multiple spheres. I find this line of thinking very compelling, and I want here to extend it in an epistemic direction, so in the direction of the effects on our position qua knowers in the political system. Wealth inequalities could be acceptable if they did not lead to a distorted distribution of epistemic authority in the democratic order. So in a democracy, we are supposed to operate under an assumption of epistemic peerness. Voting and speaking rights are distributed equally among citizens, regardless of class, race, or gender, or other differences. It turns out that this assumption is made most explicit in the philosophy of ancient Athenian democracy. Consider this passage from Plato's Protagoras, where Socrates, the philosopher, explains to the sophist why politics does not seem like something that can be taught. He remarks on the practices of ancient Athens, and he says, when the question is an affair of state, then everybody is free to have a say: carpenter, tinker, cobbler, sailor, passenger, rich and poor, high and low. Anyone who likes gets up, and no one reproaches him, as they tend to do when it's a matter of technical expertise, like the building of a ship. So being rich does not give you an advantage, no more than technical expertise does. Anyone can speak on matters of the common good. And this assumption is the foundation of Athenian democracy. It's echoed through Athenian democratic ideology, for example, in Pericles' funeral oration as well, where the idea is that poverty is no obstacle to holding political office. Compare this with modern democracies, where poor people often cannot dream of being elected to power and frequently do not even vote. So what is the harm when we start questioning the assumption that the opinion of the poor is worth as much as the opinion of the wealthy? Well, extreme wealth inequality skews who gets heard, whose experiences count as evidence, and which problems are recognized as real and worth addressing. And this produces what Miranda Fricker calls epistemic injustice. Some groups are systematically disbelieved or ignored, and the result is policy failure as a form of knowledge failure. When decision makers live in radically different material worlds than the rest of us, they misunderstand how policies work in practice. They rely on abstractions and models instead of lived experience. They mistake privilege for normality. Wealth inequality thus creates informational blind spots. It's not necessarily bad intentions or power grabs, but truly bad understanding, bad epistemics. Clear example for me that I borrow from from France really is climate policy. So carbon taxes are often presented as an elegant technocratic solution to climate change. But they are regressive, disproportionately burdening working class people who depend on cars to get to work and lack access to public transportation. And in France, ignoring this lived reality led directly to the Yellow Vest movements in France. Similar epistemic failures appear actually in the pension reform debates and in immigration policy, where elites, so urban people who are insulated from the social consequences experienced in working class neighborhoods, tell us that pension reform is just a matter of accounting, or immigration policy immigration is a net good economically, and so we can be sort of immune to the cultural and social disruptions. That's not just plutocratic politics in action, it is institutionalized misthinking. Domination by affluent urban elites, again, produce policies that are not only unjust, but often simply bad. So we can return to ancient Athens to see how they managed to keep wealth from distorting politics and minimize these epistemic failures. They made several procedural choices. First, they did not rely primarily on elections to distribute political office, but on rotation and sortition. Elections were seen by them as oligarchic, favoring the wealthy, and were reserved for roles requiring specific expertise, not political judgment as such. Second, they imposed heavy fiscal obligations on the rich, who were expected to fund public goods, like religious celebrations or weapons or ships, in exchange for social recognition. Third, they had strong accountability mechanisms, including the famed practice of ostracism, whereby you could exile for 10 years a perceived threat to the community, and that was often used against wealthy people who looked like they were going to take over the democracy or lead to excessive concentrations of power. We do none of these things today. We distribute political office through elections that systematically oversample the affluent and end up result in policies that systematically are systematically overly responsive to the preferences of the affluent. Second, wealthy people pay relatively little tax compared to their wealth. And finally, we are liberals, so we're not even thinking of excluding wealthy demagogues, leaving ourselves vulnerable to figures like say, Trump. So obviously, I don't think we can plausibly reintroduce illiberal practices like ostracism, but we could do the first two things that kept the wealthy in check in ancient Athens: tax them and introduce randomly selected citizens' assemblies to correct the epistemic distortions of elected bodies. It's really striking to me that President Macron himself, after he had convened the Citizens' Convention for Climate as a response to the Yellow Vest crisis, recognized that he could have saved himself months of disruptive protest if he had done that before. Because what came out of the Climate Convention in 2020 were 149 solutions to climate change, none of which included a carbon tax at the national level. The 150 citizens thought that a carbon tax could be a good idea, but only at the EU level, not just at the French level. Strikingly, though, even though he said that, it did not occur to him to do the same for pension reform, with the results we've seen in France, where 2 years of forcing that reform through ended up with a suspension of the reform this past fall. So in conclusion, it's possible in principle that wealth inequalities need not matter politically, But this will only be true under a regime far more authentically democratic than the one we currently inhabit, one that does not already tilt the playing field so heavily in favor of the wealthy. And I'm just on time. Thank you very much.
Over to Oren. Thank you, Hélène.
All right, back over here. All right. Well, thank you for inviting me. I am, for the most part, a fairly harsh critic of what is going on in economics, but have tremendous admiration for the work that Duran and Simon and David are doing. And so was delighted to be able to be here speaking with all of you, particularly as someone who is neither a political philosopher or even necessarily much of an economist. But I hope maybe that could be helpful in giving a little bit of a pragmatic lens to this question of why we care about wealth inequality and particularly why it matters so much in a political context. Because it seems to me that what has happened, and there are people on the edges doing all sorts of more interesting things, but in the mainstream of our thinking on these questions, the political scientists have overwhelmingly deferred to the economists. The economists have overwhelmingly said, you know, in our equations, inequality doesn't matter. And if we have problems, we can just sort of take some money from some people and give it to others. And therefore, we don't have anything to discuss. But it seems to me that that makes two mistakes. First of all, it leaves far too much to the economists. And also that when we do listen to the economists, they have mostly gotten it wrong. So those are the two things I want to try to speak about for a minute or two. And I think maybe to frame what we are talking about, I presume for the most part what we are all most excited about is democratic capitalism as a social system that we are hoping to preserve and advance and in which we want to know what role inequality plays. And so the starting point I think it's very important to recognize is that democratic capitalism as a social system includes formal democracy in the sense of free speech, in the sense of fair one person, one vote elections. But that is nowhere near sufficient. That is actually a sort of baseline requirement, but a very small piece of getting us to the sort of system, to the support for human flourishing that we really care about. And so when we think about how the broader system operates, one thing that's important to say is there are some ways in which inequality is good. That we certainly want some inequality to the extent that it is proportionate and fair to the contributions that people have made. We like incentives, we like rewards. We don't think communism solves our problems. There are also ways in which concentrations of capital are very economically beneficial and quite important actually to advancing progress. But I think nevertheless it's the case both that the source of inequality matters tremendously and then that the level of inequality matters tremendously. And so, you know, one piece of this is really, let's put the economics, the sort of material considerations to the side and just recognize that as a matter of human nature, inequality matters. That it doesn't actually matter what the economics tells us. If people don't feel that resources are being distributed fairly in our market system, they will not support that system. And so whereas there are all sorts of inequality that are in fact necessary, people need to feel that there is difference in outcomes, it becomes a very big problem when, for instance, the richest people in the society appear to be those who are trading assets in speculative circles on Wall Street. It's not possible to actually square that with any sense that the inequality we are experiencing is productive or fair. I think likewise we have a huge problem of inheritance, and one that we are really only going to face for the first time in this generation. The Wall Street Journal has started to do some good reporting on this, but the amount of wealth that we are about to see transferred from retiring and passing boomers to my generation is going to be like nothing in human history, and it is going to lead to one set of us never really having to worry very much about money again, and one set of us still feeling a dramatic sense of precarity with no connection to anything we have done. Now again, we don't want to say there should be no inheritance. It is in fact a part of what we do believe is just and fair, that people are able to pass down what they have earned. But the way it is about to be reflected is likely to be one that would very seriously challenge our conceptions of a fair society in which market outcomes are functioning the way they should. And so regardless of how well we can justify it on economic grounds, the reality is that if people don't have faith in the system, if they don't feel it is advancing their interests, they will reject it. And so for that reason alone, we need to do better. That being said, I think there's an awful lot to say about the reasons people are right to care. Even if they were wrong to care, their care would be valid per se, but in fact, I think they're right. And there's actually an almost overwhelming set of reasons. I tried to boil it down to 5, but even this is fairly incomplete. And you'll see that are related in various ways. One reason I think wealth inequality is so important and people care about it so much, regardless of their own material circumstances, is that at the end of the day, we are allocating scarce resources. And in a world of high wealth inequality, resources go to the people with the wealth, regardless of who actually values them most. For the economists in the room, we may think fondly of Coase's elegant solution to the problem of social cost, but in fact, it's a bizarre non-solution because who you assign the property right to initially, in fact, determines most of what ends up happening in a society where most people can't possibly afford all of the things they might want. And so you have one way of thinking about it is what I would call the Learjet problem, which is that if you have some limited amount of fuel, it is surely the case that that fuel is better allocated and used by a family driving across the state to visit grandma than it is fueling a jet to Davos when there's a perfectly good business class ticket available. But our economic system will allocate that to the Learjet, and we will say that that is fair and the best allocation of resources purely because of the unequal starting endowments. More concretely for everybody, we now have a situation where all of the country's best teachers will be allocated, to the extent they're sensitive to market incentives, to the highest income school districts, because those school districts can afford to pay more. And so even if you can show that the material living standards, the amount of wealth available to everyone in this country is higher than ever before, you are still in a situation where those who are being left behind, who are earning relatively less, who are accumulating relatively less wealth, are entirely correct to be upset and to feel that they are substantively worse off. A second issue is positional goods, which people understand well, but it's important to say just how broadly positional goods characterize virtually everything we care about in our lives, that they define the standard of participation in the economy, in the society. If you can afford to go out to Olive Garden for your anniversary, and Olive Garden is a punchline on Saturday Night Live, you are now worse off, even if Olive Garden is better than the best food that King Louis XIV could ever have afforded. There's a fundamental security issue. Here at MIT, I'm sure everyone is familiar with the concept of FU money, which refers to the amount you have to have, at which point you now have power over your employer. We have a lot of free market economists who assume that the labor market is simply free and just on all sides, but in fact, it works for those who do not have to worry whether they will be paid 2 weeks later, and is a complete disaster for anybody who does have to worry about that. Number 4, solidarity. There's a fundamental issue of cross-subsidization in a society. Do we have people of different wealth levels living together, or has inequality become so extreme that they are divided out? This is the source of the teacher problem, that we now have all of the people who have the wealth living in entirely different places from those that don't. And then finally, there's a fundamental problem of opportunity. We don't even need to guarantee equal opportunity. Most people would be happy with just enough opportunity to build a decent life, to raise kids in the community they want to live in. But at levels of wealth inequality like we have today, we can't actually say that we are offering that to many of those at the bottom. So I think there are a tremendous number of policy implications for this. We can certainly jump into them in the Q&A. Just to note 2, One, I would say it's important to note that taxing and spending and redistribution is second best at best. It is a way to bump up that material living standard, but it is not a solution to the kinds of problems that actually plague democratic capitalism. And second, I would just say I mentioned briefly the idea of worker power. But worker power is actually one of the most important things we can do to counteract that inequality on the dimensions that matter. You can have very high levels of formal inequality with none of the problems that I've just described if you are running an economy in which, through both formal and informal mechanisms, workers of all kinds actually have equal power to employers, to those who do have significant wealth. Thank you.
It's a really great pleasure to address you today, and I really appreciate being invited. I want to focus in thinking about why wealth inequality matters, to focus on just one segment of that question, and this has to do with truly immense fortunes. Many questions can be raised about less than immense fortunes. But if we think about where those really immense fortunes come from, by and large, they come either from sharp or very lucky speculative trading in financial assets, or through founding and leading major corporations. I'm going to focus on just that piece that has to do with founding and leading great corporations. If we think about current threats to democracy, I think we can find many of them right there. That is, I don't think we can successfully analyze why wealth inequality matters apart from the exercise of astonishingly great degrees of corporate power over the lives not only of workers who work for those firms, but also on the wider community. Starting around the 1990s in the United States, the nature of antitrust law changed fundamentally as the federal courts became persuaded by a doctrine advanced by Robert Bork, one-time failed nominee for the Supreme Court, whose main legal influence actually took place in the area of antitrust. Essentially, what Bork argued was that antitrust has solely to do with consumer interests. It doesn't have to do with workers' interests or the interests of communities or maybe a general democratic interest in preventing corporate power from overwhelming public authorities, democratic authorities. And consequently, that resulted in more or less the de facto suspension of effective enforcement of antitrust, and hence the enormous concentration of wealth in just a handful of corporations. So today, the big 7 tech corporations in America account for an immense percentage of the total stock value in the United States. I can't remember the exact number, but it's shocking if you hear it. Just 7 firms. And what does that actually mean for democracy? And also these firms, of course, are led typically by founders or by CEOs who have virtually untrammeled power and control not only of their personal wealth, but control over the disposition of the wealth of those firms. Someone like Mark Zuckerberg, personally immensely wealthy, also holds a majority of all of the voting shares in Meta. That is, his word is, he's not even accountable to a board of directors since he holds a majority of the voting shares. A number of tech firms are organized in this way. Or the board is so subordinate to the founder, for instance, in the case of X and Tesla, to Elon Musk, that really Musk can do whatever he likes, not only with his personal wealth, but with the wealth that is controlled by the firms that he founded and leads. Some implications, I think, follow from this immense concentrated wealth and power in a handful of firms. Number one, de facto independence, unaccountability to the rule of law. It's interesting that the tech bros talk about disruption as a great virtue of their style of innovation. But what does disruption actually mean? I think it means breaking the law with, as a means of fostering new business models and vast growth of corporate wealth, with the confidence that one will not be held accountable. So for instance, the rideshare companies, Uber and Lyft, in violation of local taxi regulations, just started their own businesses. They got away with it. We have the AI companies now who have supported the mass violation of copyright by going to illegal places and paying pirated book sites millions of dollars to download millions of books illegally, trampling on the copyrights of authors and publishers. The list goes on and on. Why is it that these great corporate leaders cannot be held effectively legally accountable? And consequently, they're undermining the rule of law established in our democracies. It's because if you even try to go after them, they'll have the power, the wealth, to hire 200 lawyers who can swamp the legal system with motions and procedural delays and so forth, and overwhelm the resources even of the Department of Justice to prosecute them. Case in point would be the failure of the Obama administration to convict even a single great banker, even though it was well known that fraud was rampant in the industry before the great financial crisis that brought not only the American economy, but the global economy to its knees. I could go on this, but that's just one problem. That is the idea that you have a class of people who are effectively not held accountable to the laws passed by democratic states. Here's a second problem, which has to do with the direct exercise of corporate power over people. This happens, of course, in the workplace. By and large, workers don't have much of a voice or any voice at all concerning the day-to-day deployment of authority over them as they work. This is having, I think, with the rise of AI, enormous potential for damage to the status and security of workers. AI, of course, can be used for good or bad, but what will it be used for in the context of shareholder democracy, where the sole goal is to maximize the wealth of the shareholders and incidentally also of the CEOs? Well, it is the capitalist firm that buys the technology of that firm, and so it will buy technology in part to minimize labor's share of the firm's revenues. And the kind of technology that is liable to do that is liable to impoverish workers and put them in a more and more precarious state, and also to de-skill them, since less skilled workers are cheaper and more replaceable than highly skilled workers. We are potentially looking at a future in which even jobs that are highly skilled esteemed and that the workers really enjoy doing and want to be excellent at get degraded and are no longer fulfilling for the worker only because the corporate leader decides, perhaps accurately, that that's a way to maximize capital share of the firm's revenues. We've seen this implemented time and again in the context of private equity, where some of the strategies for maximizing profits include de-skilling the workers, putting them on AI-generated algorithms, which intensify the pace of work and eliminate every aspect of that work that is both fulfilling to the worker, but also that customers appreciate. Anyone who has tried to get customer service from a bot rather than a human being knows exactly what I'm talking about. So what I want to stress here is that when we think about why wealth inequality matters, we need not only to look at personal fortunes, which themselves, of course, can be used to undermine democracy in the standard ways that we're familiar with in the funding of candidates, immense lobbying power in Congress, and so forth. That's all there, too, as a threat to democracy. But I also want to stress that, especially in our high-tech age, the prospect of the rolling out of forms of artificial intelligence that will degrade the character of work as well as the quality of services to customers and have immensely negative impacts on wider communities, as we see with the rollout of private equity across one after another industry, including, importantly, journalism and healthcare. All of this power is being exercised in ways that democracies have found unwilling or unable to control. Who controls that power and those decisions is the heads of corporations that themselves have immense power due to the concentration of corporate wealth in a few unaccountable corporations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for those stimulating talks. Before we we allow questions from the audience, could I invite you each to respond to each other?
Well, I'll say something. I think, Elizabeth's comments raised, in my mind, a point that I'd wanted to emphasize, which is I do think there's a huge difference between thinking about wealth inequality in terms of what the very wealthiest people have versus thinking about wealth inequality in terms of what the sort of upper class mass controls. I think I would probably disagree with Elizabeth a little bit on this point. It seems to me that the extremely wealthy, first of all, under sort of any system of capitalism, you're going to have large corporations that therefore control huge amounts of wealth. You're going to have founders. And there are actually a lot of plausible ways that a democratic system can check those and does effectively check those. It seems to me the much bigger challenge for us is what to do with a sort of more fundamental bifurcation in the society where you have an entire class that represents the mass of purchasing power, that represents the elite in every set of institutions that are essentially the political leaders and the ones who make all the decisions. And if you have too much inequality between that cohort and the ordinary household, I think it's very hard to see a path forward for democracy to function well.
Well, I just want to say that there is a problem with the top 10%, and I'm not neglecting that. The top 10% do have overweening power in part because of their wealth. But I think there's a separate, and I think in many ways more urgent problem with the top maybe 1,000th of 1% who have spectacular amounts of power that is effectively unchecked by any democratic means. What to do about that? Well, I do think vigorous antitrust is really something we have to be looking at seriously. And there are very strong arguments that Bork's understanding of antitrust was really a deep misunderstanding. So that's really a first place that I would be looking to change our situation, but also to think more seriously about workplace democratization so that workers would have a say in the deployment of technology that would radically transform the nature of their work lives.
Yes, Katrina, if I may interject as well, since we're already talking about solutions, I second Lee's invocation of workplace democracy. I think that corporations are engines of inequalities, and I think if we had corporate governance reforms that give more voice to the workers, you probably would end up with maybe less of a difference between white-collar salaries, working-class, blue-collar salaries. You would have maybe less obscene levels of compensation at the top. You would have maybe a different way of generating profit. But there's a maybe less ambitious solution as well that I'm currently exploring with work with Economist colleagues, Luigi Zingales and Oliver Hart, where we're exploring the potential of corporate governance reform within the framework of what's called shareholder democracy, because this framework actually is not really realized. Right now, it's dictatorship by a few managers at the top who are barely accountable to the shareholders. So, and it turns out shareholders, after all, because there are so many of them, and they are also moral human beings, sometimes would be very happy to sacrifice a tiny bit of profit or return on their shares for some ethical considerations like the environment, animal suffering, stuff like that. But they're never asked, and they're never asked because it's actually technically complicated. So you have methods like pass-through voting, but there's so much rational apathy that it's not very informative. But you could also import the concept of citizens' assemblies, which I've briefly touched on during my presentation, to the world of shareholder democracy. And that's what we're trying to push forward. The concept of investor assemblies, right? Where you would have representatives of the shareholders chosen not by election because of the oligarchic bias and all the problems linked to rational apathy in elections, but on the basis of one lottery ticket, one share. But then that, of course, introducing a slight problem, which is there because the framework is shareholder democracy. You consider that the morally relevant units are the shares. So in the end, you also overrepresent the wealthy investors. But it's been an interesting disagreement to have with my economist co-author about how do we introduce representation of shareholders qua human beings with a full range of preferences that sometimes, go against pure value maximization and the fact that we're constrained by this framework. So it's very interesting, and I feel like it's one of those things. If we can't go to workplace democracy right away, let's at least explore corporate governance reform that constrain the managers, because they, of course, they not just in corporations, but in investment funds like Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, they're moving money around with zero accountability. I mean, and sometimes because of the uncertainty associated with our decisions, they smuggle in a lot of political preferences that are not those of the shareholders they claim to represent. They tend to skew much more right-wing, actually. So when they say they maximize shareholder value, oftentimes they're not doing that. They're just smuggling their political preferences. So I think there's a whole area ripe for exploration with this idea of investor assemblies and trying to make the concept of shareholder democracy a lot more meaningful than it currently is.
Oren, perhaps I could invite you to also speak to some of these questions about solutions, because I thought that, your diagnosis of the wrongs of inequality was importantly distinct from Hélène and Liz, but I wondered where you would point to solutions coming from. Is it legislative, democratic assemblies, and so on? What are you thinking?
I mean, I think there are a lot. Oh, did you say Oren?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. I think there are a lot of different pieces to this. I certainly agree with Elizabeth that we need more antitrust enforcement. But I think that the fundamental question comes down to the structure of our economy and the framework in which people are able to accrue wealth. I think the basic model that works most effectively for democratic capitalism is when you have essentially a mutual dependence, where if you want to accrue a lot of wealth, if you want to generate a lot of profit, you actually have to do that by using the other people who are around you in the same communities as you. And so I think, this is a place where globalization has proved to be a real problem. Globalization has worked extraordinarily well if the goal is to maximize the quantity of stuff that we can all consume, but it has meant releasing the fundamental connection between the people who are wielding all of the capital and generating the profit and the fortunes of a typical worker. I think you have a parallel problem if you pursue an immigration system that says if you can't find an American to do the job, you are entitled to have someone else do it. I think the phrase jobs Americans won't do is actually something of a canary in the coal mine for a dangerously unequal system and conception of how our system should operate. And then I think, as several of us have mentioned, I do think the financialization of the economy is a real problem in and of itself. I think we've accepted a model in which we're supposed to believe that whoever is generating profit must be doing something valuable, and increasingly people are finding ways to generate a lot of profit while doing nothing of value. And I think we need to have a lot more confidence in our ability to notice that when you're issuing a crypto coin or starting a high-frequency trading hedge fund or doing a massive leveraged buyout, and say, actually, that's not what financial markets are for. That's not why we run a financial system in the first place. And we're not really interested in that as an activity that is a path to significant wealth.
Liz, would you like to come in on that question of value, since I know you have thought very deeply about these questions?
Yes, so I'm largely in agreement with Oren on the minimal value creation of an awful lot of financial trading and business schemes. And it's a genuine question about how immense fortunes can be acquired in this way. And I just want to point out one aspect of why that's so. And it has to do with the fact that the central banks and the federal government of the United States and of other major states have effectively franchised the ability to create money out of thin air. That's what a national bank is. You have $10 on deposit and you get to loan out $100. Where did that $90 come from? Out of thin air. Okay, private banks have the ability to do that. And consequently, they have the ability to engage in various kinds of financial engineering, creating new types of assets and so forth, derivatives upon derivatives upon derivatives, as a means by which they can capture a greater and greater percentage of the money that they're creating out of thin air, thereby servicing speculation rather than the real economy, where people need loans to buy cars and houses or found small businesses and so forth. We could change those rules to ensure that more of money creation is dedicated to the real economy rather than to financial engineering for the sake of speculative profits. and I think we ought to do that. I wanted to add something to Hélène's point about experimentation with even the shareholder model of corporate governance. I agree entirely that there isn't really shareholder democracy with one share, one vote. Shareholders are by and large sidelined even from corporate governance. And I really just want to put in strong advocacy for the idea of experimentation with various democratic forms across all domains of the economy. So 2 cheers for you, 3 cheers for you, Hélène, for thinking about that as one domain in which we could test things out and see whether we get better results.
Thank you, Liz. And since I'm here, I'll just plug the fact that we're looking for funding for an investor assembly with Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, anyone who wants to support an experiment with 150 randomly selected shareholders, putting forward some ethical guidelines about investment strategies. We're looking for support. So.
Right, fantastic. Could I invite the audience to line up at the mics for Q&A as well, please? I won't be able to see you, but someone else will.
I'll help with that part, Katrina. So the mics are here. If you just stand up, come to one of the microphones. This is because the event is obviously being recorded, and we'd like to make sure we capture your voice correctly. Okay, we have about 10 people. No, we have nobody yet at the microphones. My co-directors who never, ever get a word in edgeways. But I think, David, you rose from your seat momentarily faster than Doron. It was split second.
First time in history.
Yes, first time in history. So David or Ter will go first, then Doron.
Great, thank you. This is terrific. So I guess, whether or not one agrees with what's said here, it's very difficult to answer the question of how we make any progress on this, right? If you think about our current taxation system, many people think it's becoming more regressive, less regressive, whatever. I think we have we talk about a tax and transfer system, but we just have a transfer system without a tax system, right? All the transfers are being made from future generations into the present, right? And so, in fact, the state has gotten more generous. The amount of subsidy given to middle and lower income households has been rising over time. We just haven't been taxed anyone to pay for it. And so everything that would be constructive in terms of wealth taxation, in terms of more progressive taxation, in terms of reduction or broadening of the tax base, not happening. Like really, and very unpopular. Inheritance taxation is more unpopular now than it was decades ago, even though so few people would be affected by it. So I guess my question is, are there any practical ways we can get a toehold on this? Where do we see examples of policies that somehow get support and make even modest incremental progress on this? And just noting finally that many countries that have implemented wealth taxes have subsequently removed them.
Well, I'll say something about this, which is I think you're exactly right about the problem of funding all of this redistribution just from the future. It's a terrible form of redistribution. I think we need probably to raise more tax revenue just to stop that. But we are never going to address any of the problems that we're discussing here through taxation.
Not even wealth taxation?
No, because think about what level of wealth tax would you have to impose to make it so that Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg don't have the disproportionate influence that we're talking about. For that matter, to make it, the case that your typical if you're going to impose a wealth tax on your typical upper income household that's, earning $200,000, $300,000 a year, has accumulated several $1 million, you can kind of cut everybody down. You're still going to have a set of hyper wealthy folks. You're still going to have a top 10% that dominates the economy under the other structures that we have. And so it seems to me that, again, we should raise more tax revenue to pay our bills, but that if we want to actually address the problems that we're talking about here, the question is much more, how do we essentially level up people who have been left behind in recent decades? Because I think at the end of the day, you can have very high levels of wealth for some people if it is happening in a context where the core allocation of goods that people care about actually reach everybody. The last thing I would just say about that, and this speaks to the need for higher levels of revenue, is that both better provision of public goods and a better system of social insurance are two things that would make a massive difference in equalizing the kind of inequality that is creating a problem without making sure everybody has the same dollars in their bank account.
So, Elizabeth or Hélène, would you like to weigh in, or should we take another question?
Yeah, just with respect to inheritance tax, I think people's opposition to it arises largely from the idea that ordinary middle class frugality is going to be hit by an inheritance tax, when that's never the case. You have to be really, really wealthy to be subject to an inheritance tax. And so part of it is just getting more empirical knowledge, and part of it is just, we've had a campaign, they call it the death tax. People think it's terrible to like hurt people just when they're at their lowest point. But the other way to look at it is people should recognize that if it's not one tax, it's another tax. And would you rather tax the living or the dead? Well, I'm very much in favor of taxing the dead. They can't be hurt anymore.
They won't complain.
Actually, can I just say really quickly, I do think it's important to, and this goes a little bit to the point I was making earlier about the just form of inequality. There's certainly a lack of information on some of these topics, and it's certainly the case that more people believe they would pay the death tax than in fact will. But if you do public opinion surveying, if you sit down a group of working class folks and focus group this, they just don't support taking people's wealth from them when they die. They think that money has already been taxed. That is the money they earned. That is being left to their kids. They aspire, whether or not they are likely to do it themselves, they aspire to. And so there's a much more fundamental sort of folk libertarianism, at least in this country, that I think is strongly and not invalidly held, that is an obstacle to the kinds of political change some people might prefer.
Hélène, you look like you might want to say something.
Yeah, I don't know. I think at this point, I no longer believe the solution will come from policy, because the incentives are not there. Politicians cannot win elections on the promise of raising taxes. It's just a fact. So it's not happening. They can't cut pension either. They're kind of stuck. So I think I believe that it will have to come from some more institutional reforms, constitutional reforms that empower citizens' assemblies, for example, to think really hard about these long-term issues and sever the incentive of re-election. Because with that incentive, you never get the amount of taxes you need. You never get the sort of policies that will be seen as punishment by the funders of parties and elected officials. So it's not going to happen through that route. In fact, I don't see any country where it's happening right now. So it's runaway deficits all the way. That's my. So I think we should go the route of like constitutional reform and corporate governance reform and sort of institutional reforms.
All right, so we have about 5 minutes left for our breaks, and we always run our conferences right on time. Let's keep to short questions and pithy answers, please.
Very quickly. So I think one agreement among the three of you is that absolute power corrupts absolutely. So if wealth leads to too much power, it's bad. And that sort of zeroes in on the aspect of wealth inequality that can be checked by institutions. But there may also be aspects of wealth that you cannot check. Like, for example, if wealth always translates into social status, and greater social status inequality inevitably leads to the kinds of inequality that Hélène was mentioning that translates across spheres, then philosophically, I guess that's very different than those that are due to institutional failures or weak checks or something like that.
Elizabeth, Oren, Hélène, quick response.
I just want to say that it's when wealth inequality gets too big, then wealth basically completely swamps all other measures of esteem. That was Rousseau's prediction. He observed it in France, and I think that's accurate. It's another reason, actually, to keep inequality within limits so that actual virtues have a chance of standing up as a measure of esteem. But, you know, you and I, Daron, we lived in an era in the 60s and 70s when people actually had a pretty strong critique of people who showed off their wealth. And we could get back to that if we could get, like, less extreme inequality.
Oren?
I agree with that. I would just say I think this speaks to the sort of the political power of wealth inequality is, in a sense, the least concerning element, because you can check it. I think we certainly have problems, but there are plenty of ways in which you can see it is checked in our society. It's the other ways that it bleeds into the way everybody experiences life that I think are the greater challenge.
Hélène?
Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, you're mute, Hélène.
Yeah, I just wanted to remark on something that struck Tocqueville when he visited the US and struck me too, actually. The fact that even though the inequalities are much bigger in the US than in my native France, for example, there's a greater reality to the idea of equality of conditions, meaning, just to caricature, you have a sense in the US still, despite all the, you know, despite the last 20, 30 years, I still feel like a billionaire can talk to a cleaning lady as an equal. I mean, it may be a little extreme as an example, but that's not the case in European countries like the UK, like France. Like the layers of hierarchy, the monarchical aristocratic legacies are very strong. And so that was the beauty of the American model, that you could be very wealthy and still treat people and be treated by other people as somewhat of a social equal. And I worry that we're going to lose that eventually, but I feel like at the societal level it's still there. And so it's not as pessimistic in a way.
So we have two questions to be posed, 2 minutes to go. Let's put both questions together and then go through the panelists, and maybe Katrina can have the last word. Anna Stansbury?
Thank you. Yeah, this follows actually very well from Liz's comment on Rousseau. We've talked a lot about policy weapons or tools in this battle. I'm interested in the role of public shame. I'm curious why our moral vernacular around inequality seems to have kind of shrunk to the lowest common denominator, not our in this room, our in this society, sort of some kind of language around fairness. Even 30 years ago in the UK, where I'm from, there were massive protests around CEO pay, going up to £475,000. You know, what happened to public shame? What better tools should we bring it back? Oh, and sorry, I'm going to add to that. It worked extremely dramatically in the Me Too movement recently. So it's not a failure of shame itself to work in our system, but on this topic specifically.
And last question, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Shaket. I'm a PhD student. I wonder if you think that we can justify these concerns even just on pure Econ 101 grounds without needing to invoke concepts like power or democracy. I don't know if you guys have seen the TV show Succession, but I think you can read it as an argument that concentrations of wealth in individuals will lead those individuals rationally to use that wealth in ways that are personally self-aggrandizing rather than maybe the economic surplus maximizing ways even that shareholders would choose to use that wealth. So I wonder if that's even a more parsimonious or more basic argument to be concerned about wealth inequality.
All right, so let's go Hélène, Oren, Elizabeth, and then Katrina. Hélène?
Yeah, I'm going to take the question about shame. I wonder about that too. Why is that completely not operational anymore? I think it's about ideology. Since basically the 80s, we've replaced the ideology of, I think, which was still somewhat there, of noblesse oblige, of, good capitalism versus bad capitalism, with the blanket statement of greed is good. The interest of General Motors is the interest of the US, a very crude reduction of the purpose of a corporation to profit maximization, which historically is a misunderstanding. It was supposed to be the channeling of private interest in the service of some public good. So I think it's ideology. Power has, I always say that, but it's true, like power has three faces. It's a sort of a dogma in political science, the agenda setting, the decision making, and the ideology. And we probably underestimate the power of ideology, and we need to change that. First of all, by changing what's being taught in economic departments and in business schools. That's where all these sort of background assumptions and beliefs are entrenched, and then they replicate. They're like genes. They just replicate in the system, and they do a lot of damage.
Oren?
I love the shame question. I'm waiting for an essay to come out that I've been working on this so that I could plug it to you, but we'll have to wait longer. I think it's a fascinating question because you do have a situation where there is so much concentrated wealth in just totally inexcusable contexts. And what you tend to see instead is the protesting, the Occupy Wall Street framing. If you think about how Elizabeth Warren or other real critics, they focus on the sort of edge cases. It's like the looting, it's this bankruptcy. These are the things that we should be upset about, instead of just saying, like, this whole thing is an absurd grift. Like, most people working and earning large amounts of money in financial markets, like, ask them what they actually do and explain why it is that this creates value for anybody else in the world. It becomes incoherent very quickly. The problem is that we now have an entirely entangled elite in which those people are best friends with everybody, including Elizabeth Warren and the people in the media and so forth, all of whom then fund wonderful buildings like this one. And so there is no incentive for anybody who actually has any influence to say, it's not even that you're hurting someone in particular, it's that this is just stupid and ridiculous. And so it would be very nice if we had that, but I think it's a fascinating social challenge. And just quickly, I completely agree on the Econ 101 point. I think the challenge is just, in Econ 101 terms, you're identifying market failures. There are lots of market failures out there that don't then implicate the health of democracy. And so the question is, what is it about this market failure that is more substantial to the well-being of the political system?
Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a call for the fact that if you look in the history of economics, we have one of the greatest economists of all time, Adam Smith, who in his theory of moral sentiments pointed out that when you have extreme class inequality, the super rich can even parade their vices and make them fashionable. And people, because we seems a flaw and a bias in our human psychology, the tendency to worship the rich and the powerful. And Smith decried that. And so what we need really to be thinking about, and this is something I think a task for economists, and it's something I've been arguing for a long time, that is, economists had to broaden their sights and recover the richer traditions of classical political economy, where you had economists dealing with these very foundational issues of, what do we value and why are we valuing this, and how is the economy promoting virtue or vice? That's what they were talking about in the 18th and 19th centuries, and economists should actually be moving in that direction and recovering some of those moral resources of their predecessors.
And Katrina, you have the final word.
Well, we're very much at time, so I won't say anything except thank you to all of you, especially the speakers, for that very stimulating session. And I'm sorry I'm not there in person standing where Simon is, but have a lovely coffee break.
So we have a 15-minute break now. Thank you very much. Thank you.